really excited to have what I hope is a good conversation with everyone. And this is a little bit of a different kind of talk, and I'm going to explain why momentarily. But like any good Congress talk, I'm going to start by putting up a picture of a member. This is John Dingell. This is John Dingell when he joins the House in the 50s. That's John Dingell when he retires from the House in the 2000s. And I feel obligated to have Dingell as a favorite member of mine. And that's not just because he was responsible for getting an earmark to fix this bridge by my apartment when I lived in Ann Arbor, though that is important. It's because Dingell is credited with what I think is every congressional procedure nerd's favorite quote about Congress, where he says, "I'll let you write the substance, you let me write the procedure, and I'll screw you every time." I've also heard this quote with more colorful language, but this is a family-friendly talk, and I am on camera, so we will leave it at that. But the reason that this is a favorite member quote for, I think, many people who spend a lot of time thinking about congressional procedure is because it's a case of a member stating pretty explicitly how I think a lot of us think about the world. That is, procedure is important in the study of Congress because it affects policy outcomes. I think most political scientists would agree on that. This is from a different book of Keith's than the one that we're celebrating this week, but I think it captures that conventional wisdom pretty well. We don't all agree on exactly how this works or why procedures persist in Congress the way they do or what causes them to change. But the idea that there are procedures that shape what Congress can do, I do think is something that we agree on. And the book that this symposium that many of us are here for is celebrating has this claim at its center. And part of why it's been influential in the field is because it formalizes in a parsimonious way how and when we should expect some particular procedures, the filibuster, the existence of the veto, to have an effect on the process. But what I want to do today is to push us to think about congressional procedure in a little bit more of a capacious way. I want to argue that the study of congressional procedure shouldn't just be about whether and how rules and procedures shape outcomes. That's really important. I wrote the whole book that Jeff was holding up before about how the Senate periodically carves out exceptions from the filibuster rule because it's thinking about the policy consequences of doing so. But procedure and how it's used are related to other important questions about Congress that aren't just about the policies that we get. So some of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be about my work. Some of it's going to be about work that others have done that speak to some broader questions, but some of it is also going to be about thinking about new research questions and more broadly kind of where do we go from here. So we have a lot of expertise on how the procedures work, which actors they empower, and we can use that knowledge to think about other questions in the study of Congress. So I'm going to put 4 additional frames through which we can think about congressional procedure on the table today. And to motivate those questions, I want to start by talking about the Congressional Review Act. So I titled this slide, "The Case of the Congressional Review Act." There are some mysterious things about the Congressional Review Act. I'm not going to get out my magnifying glass and go solving them today. But just some basics. The Congressional Review Act was signed into law in 1996. And when an agency finalizes a rule, before it can take effect, the agency has to submit that rule to Congress and to the Government Accountability Office. Congress then has a specified time period to decide whether or not to pass a joint resolution overturning the rule. And that joint resolution is considered under special procedures in the Senate. After Congress gets the rule, once 20 calendar days have passed, 30 senators can discharge a joint resolution disapproving of that rule from committee. And then there's a non-debatable motion to bring it up on the floor. This eliminates 2 potential hurdles for the resolution that would be present without these procedures. The ability to keep the resolution in committee and the ability to filibuster it on the motion to proceed. Debate on the resolution is then limited to 10 hours, which prevents the possibility of a filibuster. And no amendments to it are permitted. So the Congressional Review Act seems like a great way for Congress to check the executive branch. But the fact that it's a disapproval resolution that has to be signed by the president has meant that it's been somewhat limited in its scope. So if the president vetoes the resolution, which is what we'd expect a president to do if it's his own administration that's promulgated the rule, Congress would need to override that veto. So that's primarily why we've seen the Congressional Review Act only used once successfully before this year in 2001, after George W. Bush took office, to overturn a rule the Clinton administration had promulgated. But this year, between January and April, we saw 13 rules that had been promulgated at the end of the Obama administration overturned by Congress. This one here involves eliminating a requirement that certain individuals would be ineligible to purchase firearms. Others involved other sort of Republican red meat issues. In every case where a disapproval resolution passed the Senate, it did so with fewer than 60 votes. So these special procedures that eliminated the possibility of a filibuster did appear to matter. And I think this makes this an illustration of how procedures do affect policy outcomes. Congress would not have been able to overturn these rules without the special procedures. But there's some other things about the CRA that I'm going to come back to that illustrate other ways that procedure matters. To give us a preview of where we're going, I want to lay out 4 alternative ways to think about congressional procedure. One is that procedure can affect the quality of lawmaking. It can have consequences for executive branch oversight. It can structure partisan conflict in Congress. And it can be related to congressional capacity. So let's start with the quality of lawmaking. So what do I mean by this? We could sort of debate at length what I mean by the quality of lawmaking. I'm not sure we'd come up with a really straightforward consensus definition that's amenable to clear measurement. But for the sake of thinking about this, I want to put a couple ideas on the table. So first, and I think this is sort of a minimal definition, is simply avoiding straight-up errors. So this is an example from a bill introduced by Tom Graves of Georgia in the run-up to the 2013 government shutdown. It's part of Republicans' effort at the time to try to keep the rest of the government open while defunding implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And this provision would have appropriated about $967 million for all federal programs, when in reality, what Graves wanted to do was appropriate $967 billion. So this is clearly a mistake. There are some missing zeros in that sentence. So I'd say that's sort of a minimal definition of what we mean by quality lawmaking. It's just avoiding those kinds of errors. A second idea, and this is sort of probably more challenging in terms of definition, is what we might call artful drafting. I mean, I take that phrase from the Supreme Court's decision in King v. Burwell, which was the Supreme Court case reviewing whether individuals could use their subsidies under the Affordable Care Act to purchase coverage on an exchange implemented by the federal government as opposed to ones run by states. And the justices in that decision referred to the ACA as being inartfully drafted. The confusion around this point about whether people could purchase coverage on a federal exchange versus state-based exchanges is one example. Another is up here, and it comes from this notion of a bridge policy, which was included in early versions of the law. Basically what it said was that people could, if you were between 100 and 138% of federal poverty level, you could choose whether you wanted to enroll in Medicaid or whether you wanted to purchase coverage on a marketplace. The assumption was that all states would expand Medicaid. The drafters didn't necessarily foresee that the Supreme Court would strike down that piece of the law. But allowing individuals this choice was more expensive. And so they ended up just going with the Medicaid expansion. But when the Senate dropped the option to choose, it never removed the language setting the floor for the tax subsidy. And so when states said that when the Supreme Court said that states did not have to expand Medicaid, it created this unintended set of consequences. And so this is a quote from a Senate staffer in reference to this piece, and says, I don't want to imply that people were being sloppy, but when you take out this one policy, you've got to check in 20 different places to make sure everything matches. The stuff was happening so quickly, and at the end, it was quite messy. So this kind of inartful drafting is often associated with speed. David Mayhew and more recently John Llewellyn have talked about this idea of the politics of haste. But I want to argue that procedural choices can play a role as well. And Justice Roberts wrote about this in the King v. Burwell case. He said, when Congress passed much of the Affordable Care Act, it did so using a complicated budgetary procedure which limited opportunities for debate and amendment. So budget reconciliation, which I write about in my book, is obviously an example of how a procedural choice can have consequences for the quality of lawmaking. There's a lot of discussion in DC these days about whether the ACA would have been more durable if it had passed with a bipartisan coalition rather than on a party line basis. There's a growing political science literature, some of which is in a volume that Jeff edited with Eric Potashnik on this question. I don't know the answer to this question in the specific context of the ACA, but I am confident that the restrictions placed on the reconciliation process by the Senate's Byrd Rule, which limits what you can do in a reconciliation bill, have had consequences for the kinds of policies that have been adopted through the process. The need to accommodate the Byrd Rule's prohibition on increasing the deficit outside a 10-year budget window is part of what made the Bush tax cuts expire, which brought us the fiscal cliff. In more recent rounds of attempted ACA repeal through reconciliation, we've seen Senate Republicans be told that they could not do a straight repeal of the individual mandate that everyone has to purchase health insurance coverage, but that they could dial back the penalty for not having insurance to 0. So it's the same, it works towards the same policy consequence, that people don't actually have to purchase insurance because there's no penalty for not doing so. But is that the most artful way to actually get that, that policy accomplished? So another way that procedural choice can affect the quality of legislation is when Congress chooses to use omnibus legislating. So we know that there can be benefits to log rolling across issues and then bringing one carefully constructed compromise to the floor. But to get the benefits of actually getting that policy change, you have to bear the cost of potentially not being able to fix errors or inartful drafting issues once the measure has actually made it to the floor for a vote. You also run the risk of just not noticing what's in the bill. So for example, in a December 2013 budget deal, Congress reduced the cost of living adjustment for military retirees between the ages of 38 and 62, but that language also affected disabled veterans. Turns out that's not really what Congress wanted to do. There was a lot of uproar about the disabled veterans piece, and they eventually had to come back and fix that problem. But that's the kind of thing that's more likely to happen when complex bills are negotiated off the floor and then brought to the floor under restrictive rules. And if they're errors, it can be harder to fix them if members are wary of going on the record a second time in favor of a particular policy. So we saw this repeatedly with the Affordable Care Act, that there are provisions in that law that in a different partisan environment, a bipartisan coalition might have been willing to change, but Republicans were very wary of having to go on the record again about anything that could be seen as supportive of the Affordable Care Act. And lastly, to return to the Congressional Review Act, one of the provisions of the CRA is that if a rule is disapproved of, the agency that issued the rule may not reissue a rule in substantially the same form or issue a new rule that is substantially the same unless Congress passes new authorizing legislation. Shockingly, it does not define substantially the same. But when we saw Congress use the CRA more aggressively this spring than we had in the past, we started to see how that particular procedure can be an especially blunt instrument for making policy. So one of the rules that Congress disapproved of this year was a large Department of Education regulation that implemented the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was the bipartisan replacement for No Child Left Behind. When Congress was considering whether or not to disapprove of that rule this spring, a lot of stakeholders, including some on the right, like the Chamber of Commerce, argued that rolling back the rule and preventing the Education Department from rulemaking in the same area would create a lot of uncertainty, especially because the underlying law is one that gives a lot of authority to the states. So in the absence of regulations, there would be a lot of confusion about what states had to do under the law versus what they could do. We've seen this play out with accountability plans that states have to file with the Department of Education. And we've gotten to this point in part because Congress chose to use an exceptionally blunt procedure to try and accomplish a particular policy goal. So the second way that I want us to think about congressional procedure today is having implications for Congress's ability to check the executive branch and exercise its oversight responsibilities. So there are a number of ways that we can think about this in our kind of more traditional procedures matter for policy framework. So one is in sort of the way that Will Howell does in Power Without Persuasion, which is to say to use a model to formalize interactions between Congress, the President, and the judiciary, and demonstrate situations in which it's difficult for the other branches to check what the President is doing. There's a broad empirical literature that looks at whether institutional arrangements in Congress affect the degree to which the President exercises his legislative authority. And we can certainly point to specific examples of the President choosing to exercise unilateral power after Congress has failed to act. In Just Chaffetz's new book, Congress's Constitution, he talks about an emerging strain of literature in the Legal Academy that talks about how congressional inaction, which itself can arise from the procedures Congress uses, as a reason for more aggressive executive action. But I want to make a more specific argument here about the relationship between procedure and oversight, which draws on some of the work in my book. So in my book, I look at the development and use of particular procedures that prevent the possibility of a filibuster. Reconciliation is one of them. And there, Congress was in part trying to solve a collective action problem. So individual congressional authorizing committees were not interested in making cuts to the programs that they oversaw. And so as part of the Congressional Budget Act, Congress developed a mechanism that could force them to do so using the reconciliation process. But there's another class of these procedures that are designed to enhance Congress's ability to oversee the actions of the executive branch, including when Congress fears that the executive branch will take some sort of action without any advance notice that will be difficult for Congress to undo later. So if the President sets a policy in motion and Congress is unable to move quickly to overturn it, then the President has a substantial advantage in policymaking in that area. So in order to ensure that Congress has the opportunity to review executive action, it's sometimes in the interest of a sufficient number of senators to include language in a statute subjecting further executive action to congressional review, but without the possibility of a filibuster in the Senate. So when members talk about these kinds of procedures, they talk about them in very principled terms. They talk about Congress and the people having a voice. So these are two quotes, one from Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, and one from Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee. They're in reference to legislation relating to congressional review of the Iran deal that I'll talk about more in a minute. And so you see here that Ernst says this enables the American people to have a voice in the Iran deal. There's a role for Congress now guaranteed, says Corker. But it turns out that exactly how Congress designs these procedures has consequences for how much input members actually have and what really the purpose of the oversight. So I'm going to talk about three recently adopted provisions of this kind. Two are related to the Iran sanctions, and one is related to the sanctions on Russia that was passed this summer. So this is the first one involving Iran, and this basically says that Congress gets to review the Iran deal before it goes into effect, but there aren't any special procedures for Congress to consider a resolution blocking the deal. There's no protected motion to proceed to bring up a resolution in the Senate that would prevent implementation of the Iran deal. There's no limitation on debate. Because it's a joint resolution, it would eventually need a two-thirds majority to override a veto, assuming Obama would have vetoed a resolution disapproving of the Iran deal. But importantly, there's no way to force a vote here. So 42 senators, all Democrats, eventually voted against cloture on a resolution blocking Obama from implementing the deal. Mitch McConnell, using his prerogative as majority leader, was able to schedule the vote because he wanted something on the record, but he didn't have to. There's no way for another member to force him to do so. And if Harry Reid had still been majority leader, chances are we never would have seen a vote at all. So a second provision in the Iran deal is a little more complicated, and this is one that's come back into the conversation more recently. So every 90 days, the president must certify that Iran is still in compliance with the deal. If he doesn't, legislation reimposing sanctions on Iran is entitled to a number of expedited procedures. So you can see here that the Foreign Relations Committee automatically gets discharged from consideration of a resolution of legislation reimposing sanctions after 10 days. There's a privileged motion to proceed to considering the bill, so it can't be filibustered at that stage. And then debate is limited to 10 hours, and there are no amendments available. So this is a very different setup than that first Iran provision. It guarantees some sort of action. There are a few different ways to think about it, but one of them would be that in 2015, when Congress was writing this legislation, Republicans may have been concerned that a future Democratic president was unlikely to tell them if the administration had noticed a violation or would be more reluctant to impose punishment on their own. So by creating this procedure, it helped ensure that Congress had a role in the policy area. So the third example is from the summer, again, involving legislation imposing or related to sanctions on Russia. So if the president wants to terminate sanctions against Russia, he must submit that proposal for congressional review. There's a review period during which the president can't take action. And during that period, either the majority or the minority leader in the Senate can introduce a resolution of disapproval. Again, there's an automatic committee discharge procedure. There's a non-debatable motion to proceed. But once the bill is on the floor, there's no limitation on debate, which means that you would still need 60 votes to invoke cloture in the presence of a filibuster threat. So basically here, Congress has set up a way to basically force a vote and debate on this policy question, but does not change the number of votes that you would need to end debate and ultimately adopt the resolution. So there may be political reasons to want to be able to force a vote on Russia sanctions, even if ultimately you still get the same policy outcome. So the Congressional Review Act also falls into this broad category. We can see how its particular structure affects how Congress can use it to overturn particular regulatory actions. So you can only bring up a Congressional Review Act resolution within 60 days of the rule being reported to Congress. So it's not the case that congressional Republicans can now go back and use fast-track procedures to disapprove of any Obama-era regulation. They're limited to the ones that were adopted late in the term. It's part of why we've only ever really seen the CRA used to overturn rules after a partisan switch in control of the presidency. So I argue in the book that when Congress designs these procedures, they're doing so with the anticipation of what the president might do given his preferences, which fits into our general procedures, structure, policies frame. But given what I'd say is increased interest, certainly among a public audience in Congress's role in the separation of powers system at this moment, it's also important to think about how these procedural choices and even small differences among them have influence on that process. And even if things like the ability of the president to veto a resolution and the necessity of Congress to override that veto, if we're actually going to see a different policy outcome, we get different politics depending on whether a vote can be forced or not. So the third way I want to think about procedure is in terms of structuring partisan conflict. And by this I mean that procedure shapes how and what and when the two parties can have partisan fights in Congress, even when the goal is not ultimately to pass or even alter a piece of legislation. So there's a literature on the relationship between partisanship and procedural rights. That is, when does the majority party, particularly in the House, try to limit versus expand the rights of the minority party to influence the content of bills? But I want us to think a little bit differently about the relationship between procedure and partisanship. I want to think about how procedures can facilitate partisan conflict. So I'm going to walk through a series of examples of when we see this happening. So this first example again comes from reconciliation and the ability of Congress to generate a piece of legislation through the reconciliation process that it knows is going to be vetoed. So we know from work by Nolan McCarty, who's here with us today, and Tim Grosclose, that Congress can have an incentive to generate this kind of veto bait bill. There's more recent work by Jeremy Gelman that suggests that failed bills can be an important signal to external allies, especially in interest groups, of what a partisan coalition might be able to do if they're given a majority in the next election. And as I discuss in the paper that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, we saw this happen in the reconciliation process in 2015. So Republicans had gotten a majority in the Senate after the 2014 elections. And despite the fact that Obama was sure to veto any bill repealing his signature domestic achievement, Republicans chose to move a repeal bill through the reconciliation process anyway. It did indeed get vetoed in January of 2016. This is Obama's veto message. But it was meant to serve as a template for what they might do in 2017 if they won the White House. We know that didn't work out, or hasn't worked out so far, but that was the underlying goal. So a second place where we see procedures structuring partisan conflict is in the budget process in both the House and the Senate. So certain components of the budget process operate under different procedures in both chambers that have made it a really attractive place to hash out partisan debates. So in the Senate, the budget resolution, like reconciliation bills, has a debate limitation and thus can't be filibustered. So in the absence of a filibuster threat, it's harder for party leaders in the Senate to structure the amendment process. So basically, under a regular legislative process, if the majority leader in the Senate wants to limit amendments, he goes to the floor, he gets recognized, he offers all the amendments that are permitted at a given point. We call this filling the amendment tree, which effectively pauses the process. So then he can either file a cloture motion or seek a unanimous consent agreement that specifies how much time will be used for debate and which amendments will be offered. But on the budget resolution, there's no need to file cloture because there's a debate limitation that means that there's no possibility of a filibuster, so he doesn't have that tool. So there are probably some procedural ways that he could limit amendments, but in practice, the majority leader does not do this, which leads to something that we have taken to calling the votorama, where lots and lots of amendments are offered on the Senate floor back to back. In the contemporary Congress, most of these are symbolic. They have no actual policy effect. This is a chart that looks, going back to the early 90s, at the share of the amendments offered to the budget resolution that are meant to simply send symbolic messages about where either individual members or the parties stand on a particular issue. So the budget resolution becomes a way for individual members and the parties to achieve particular goals. It also allows members to force members of the opposite party to take difficult votes. And part of why it's able to do that is because of the procedures that it's considered under. So in the House, meanwhile, appropriations bills are now basically the only place where members get to offer amendments under open rules. Since 2011, there have only been 11 non-spending bills in the House that have come to the floor under an open rule. And so one consequence of this is that members transfer their various goal-seeking behaviors to appropriations bills. So this is a graph that tracks the amendment demand, so the number of amendments proposed per appropriations bill. We've seen this increase over the past 15 or so years. It's more or less a monotonic increase if we take out that big spike in 2009, which, if you're curious, is thanks to now retiring Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, who offered 553 amendments to the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill in 2009. These were almost entirely to strip out other members' earmarks. So Flake was, when he was in the House, he was known as an anti-earmark crusader. And so he would, on these appropriations bills, offer lots and lots of amendments trying to take out other people's earmarks. But sometimes the displacement of this partisan conflict onto the appropriations process means that the whole appropriations process gets bogged down. So a great example of this comes from 2015, when House Republicans had to pull an appropriations bill from the floor over a debate involving the display of the Confederate flag in federal cemeteries. So Republicans basically had a choice. They could either leave the bill on the floor and without the amendment in it, in which case they'd lose conservative votes on the final bill, or they could force more moderate members to vote for something that had the amendment in it. John Boehner saw this as really sort of a bad choice, and so his response was just to pull the whole bill from the floor. And that was basically the end in 2015 of the House considering appropriations bills one at a time. This is a graph from Frances Lee's book, Insecure Majorities, that looks at some of this same amendment behavior, but more broadly in the Senate. And she argues that we've seen evidence of a broader trend in the use of amendments to force votes for purely messaging purposes, where messaging is an attractive sounding idea that one party's members support, the other party's members do not, and is not actually expected to become law. So these amendments are meant to demonstrate what the minority party wants and what the majority party does not. This graph shows that the share of amendments in the Senate that have received recorded votes, we've seen an increase over time in the share of those that are offered by the minority party. And the minority party can force these votes as part of the part of the off-the-floor negotiations that now generally precede a cloture vote. So the minority will only agree to vote for cloture if they get some amendments. Increasingly, the parties will reach agreements that say that they'll have these votes on amendments, but the votes on the amendments themselves will need, they'll stipulate that they need 60 votes to carry, but won't require an actual cloture motion, which speeds up the process. And this is all to say that the two parties are working together to create opportunities for partisan conflict within the confines of the existing procedures. Lastly, I want to return to the CRA again. These are different than amendments that are designed to fail or are meant primarily for messaging purposes, but it does give us a useful universe in which to explore how a partisan agenda is constructed. So at the end of the Obama administration, there was a universe of rules that could potentially be overturned by the Congressional Review Act at the start of the Trump administration. So these were rules that were finalized towards the end of the Obama administration. And Republicans figured this out pretty quickly. By December 2016, the Senate Republican Policy Committee had identified 11, they're listed here, that were priority items for Senate Republicans. About half of them saw action, but about half of them did not. There were also 7 additional rules that weren't on this original list that got overturned. So this is obviously a really small n, but this is an interesting place where the existence of a certain set of procedures can help us define a universe for investigating how a party prioritizes some issues over others. So I want to talk about one last question here that doesn't have anything to do with the CRA. And the final way I want us to think about congressional capacity or congressional procedure is as affecting congressional capacity. By this, I mean, is Congress equipped to do the work of legislating? So there's increasing interest among people in the congressional reform community about this issue. And the argument is basically that if Congress doesn't have the resources and expertise it needs to carry out its work, it has to rely more heavily on lobbyists or delegate more responsibility to the executive. So I don't want to make sort of normative judgments about those questions here, but I do think it's important to think about understanding the institution and how it works and what the implications of that are for the ability of members and their staffs to work effectively. So the idea that knowing and understanding procedure has implications for one's influence in the legislative process isn't new. This is from Walter Olejek's volume on congressional procedure that I imagine many of us have had to read at some point. And one of the things that he says is that policy outcomes are more likely to be influenced by members with procedural expertise. But how do members and their staffs develop that expertise? So I want to argue that in the contemporary Congress, the heavy reliance on centralized decision-making disincentivizes members and their staffs from becoming procedural experts. So if party leaders are going to make all the decisions, and if they're going to do so behind closed doors, then why will members and their staffs spend time learning the ins and outs of things like the amendment process, reconciliation rules, et cetera? As a result, members and their staffs have to rely more on the information they get from leaders, which in turn gives leaders more power to shape the outcome. Jim Curry's book, Legislating in the Dark, does a nice job of demonstrating how this works in the House, where leaders use things like self-executing rules and shorter layover periods to give themselves more influence. This is especially true, he documents, when leaders think there's high potential for outside groups to serve as credible alternative sources of information for members. So there are obviously a lot of reasons why members might want party leaders to have a lot of power. We have whole literature on cartel theory versus conditional party government that gets into this. But my point here is about the consequences. When party leaders have more power, it may also mean that we have a lot of members and their staffs who end up not knowing much about how the institution works, and it makes it harder for them to have influence in the process if they want to. So I don't want to suggest that this is a new consideration. This is an interview from the late 70s with former Senate parliamentarian Floyd Riddick, who argued that this was a problem in the early 20th century. As the government began to grow bigger and bigger, senators had less time to devote to procedure, and it was just natural that they had to begin to depend on somebody to do the procedural aspects for them. That person was the parliamentarian, so this is in the context of the development of the parliamentarian's office. We also see this when we look at Congress's early experiences with reconciliation. This is a quote from the CQ Almanac from the first major use of reconciliation in 1981, where it talks about how how members were substantially confused about what they were doing and the ground rules under which they were operating. So there's lots more to know here. And as I know that Andrew has argued in some other work, it can be difficult to develop an empirical strategy that actually isolates the consequences of an under-resourced, where here I mean under-resourced by lacking in procedural expertise legislature. But I do want to put up a couple data time series that are consistent with the idea that congressional offices have less procedural expertise now than they once did. So again, I'm not telling a causal story here. This is just sort of a high-level gut check. So the first is some data from Vital Statistics on Congress, which Jeff mentioned in his introduction, which tracks since 1981 the share of House and Senate staff that are in the states and districts versus in Washington. So the lighter blue line at the top is the House, the darker blue line at the bottom is the Senate. And so you can see that over time, a greater share in both chambers of the staff are now out in the states and districts than in Washington. So it's not a measure of expertise, but it is a signal about where members might be investing their resources. So if you're a district-based aide to a rank and file member of the House, your job is much less likely to involve understanding the amendment process. These are actually two additional graphs from Francis Lee's Insecure Majorities that look at the share of leadership staff in the House and the Senate that are devoted to communications functions since the early 1960s. So in both chambers, we see party leaders devoting more and more of their staff, about up to about 30% in the House and about 40% in the Senate, to communications functions. So Lee sees this as a signal that parties care more about messaging than they once did. I see it as also consistent with less of an investment in procedural expertise. So again, this isn't a causal story about a decline in institutional expertise, but it's consistent with such a story. There's some new data being collected by a team led by Tim LaPira at James Madison to survey congressional staff. And one of the things that people are asked about is their knowledge of the institution. So for example, Senate staff will be asked, do you know why the majority leader frequently votes against cloture? This data should help answer one of my basic questions here, which is, do staff actually understand the institution in which they're working? And if we're going to think about the relationship between procedures and policy outcomes, we should also be thinking about how the chamber is organized to incentivize certain people to gain knowledge of those procedures, or in some cases, to not spend the time learning about them. So I'm going to conclude, and then I'm happy to take questions and just have a general conversation by returning to the Dingell quote that I started with. And so what I want us to take away from what I talked about today is not that Dingell is wrong, not at all, but I want us to think about a broader set of contexts in which procedure matters than the most straightforward implication of Dingell's argument. So it's not just about the existence of the filibuster or the ability of a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate to be able to override a veto, or even the ability of the House Rules Committee to protect the substance of a bill on the House floor by reporting out a restrictive rule. Those are all important. But as I've laid out today, in the contemporary Congress, where there's less and less substantive legislating, it's equally important to think about how procedure affects the legislative process in other ways. The current Congress clearly does a lot of omnibus legislating, and we should think critically about what it means for the quality of that legislation. I don't think that the reconciliation process is going to be the only way we ever see major policy change happen in Congress, but I do think the attractiveness of it as a tool in certain circumstances will mean it's an important part of the policymaking process. We've also talked about how specific questions of how you design oversight procedures can matter for how the review process for executive actions proceeds. We're obviously in a moment where there's a lot of attention to those issues. We're also in a period of high partisan conflict, and the desire to have that play out in the procedural places where it has implications for how much Congress is able to accomplish it. And in the congressional capacity context, it's important to understand who the possible yous, you write the substance, you let me write the procedure, are in Dingell's statement. Who has the procedural knowledge to be able to screw other people with? So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions, and like I said, just have a broader conversation about some of these issues.
So it seems like, so you have these four lenses. There's quality, executive oversight, structuring partisan conflict, and then the capacity of Congress to actually legislate. And so when you're talking about some of the quality of legislative quality, I was really trying to think about what does it mean what are the conditions under which are the factors that we need to have quality bills written, maybe is the way to think about that. And so speed makes a lot of sense. So if you slow down, that gives you more time. So time is something that's important. But then one of the other things that you had mentioned is that by going through regular order as opposed to sort of these behind closed doors or sort of sneaky procedures or whatever we want to call them, that increases the error rate or however we want to think about that. And so what is it that you think about those processes that increase the error rate? Is it less eyes on the ball? Is it, like, what is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I certainly think that's a possibility, that the fewer sort of people who have their hands on it might mean that, if there are only a handful of people working on it, that it's more likely. For me, I actually think the bigger consequence is that when you choose to use a process where everything is behind closed doors from the start. So one thing that I think has been interesting to watch in Congress this year, with both the healthcare bill and the tax bill that Republicans are currently working on, is that Republicans chose to start the process behind closed doors and keep it behind closed doors the whole time. So we've seen lots of other examples of where it's been beneficial to getting a deal done, to particularly at the end of the process, once a more open process has not worked, for people to close the doors and say, you know what, we couldn't work this out in a more open environment, so we're going to take advantage of things not being public, take advantage of less pressure from outside groups to try to really hash out a deal here. But oftentimes that comes at the end of a process after a more open bipartisan process hasn't worked. And so that's a difference from what we've seen this year. And so how this relates to your question is to say that I think that when you do the whole thing behind closed doors and when you rely increasingly on kind of restrictive procedures, a bigger consequence is that once you do bring it out into the open, it's harder to revisit pieces of that deal. It's harder to make like even small changes because it threatens to unravel something that people may not be super excited about anyway because they didn't have input into developing it. So for me, that's the biggest one, but I think it's an important question, and to really kind of unpack the mechanism behind which it means, like what does it mean for, why do we have more, or why might we have more errors when we do big bills, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So one of the things that, when I hear this argument that we have this trend over time where there's less expertise either housed in leader offices or, you know, the example of pastor, it seems to suggest that the whole institution is bankrupt of expertise, of procedural expertise in some way. My response is to ask why, and the answer, you know, the simplest sort of Occam's razor answer is because the optimal use of scarce resources dictates it, right? That it must not be very important to members and staff if they're not allocating time and energy toward expertise. So if we think about what that means in the context of a lot of our models of lawmaking or organization or other sort of aspects of legislative decision making, one of the things that it might sort of teach us, and probably runs directly contrary to the quote, is that if we had more dynamic models explicitly, it helps sort of understand why, in fact, lack of procedural expertise does not necessarily add up to a sort of screwing of most members most of the time, right? So presumably there's sort of a set of norms about what would happen if whoever is in charge of the, you know, whether it's a rotation of people paying attention or whether it's some leadership vested expertise, it seems like at some point, right, in hindsight, you would be able to figure out that substantively you were screwed by procedures you didn't understand, right? I mean, there are fire alarms, right? There are lots of people to report this. And so I guess it seems like there's a real missing piece of the story, particularly from a theoretical standpoint here, that has to be about the fact that I can look backwards at what happened procedurally in the past and what the substantive implications are.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's part of why I put this up in sort of a graphical representation of this in a cyclical nature, is because in some ways it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you don't have the incentive to become an expert. You have to rely on someone else, and then how do you reverse this trend?
But I'm just saying, I mean, maybe you don't want to. I mean, maybe conditions dictate that there would be no incentive to do so.
Right, and so I guess my question is, if conditions change and the incentive, and somehow rank and file members do want to start having more influence, how do they get out of this cycle? So I think the Freedom Caucus might actually be a good example of this now, of a group of members who are trying to break out of this, who are trying, and in some cases have successfully acquired procedural expertise that has allowed them to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do had they not known about the procedures. So the idea that Mark Meadows figured out, and his compatriots figured out, that you could use the motion to vacate the chair to start to pressure Boehner. And we can debate whether that's ultimately what led John Boehner to stop being speaker or not. But I think that it sort of speaks to this, which is to say that as that's a case where some members did acquire a piece of procedural knowledge that helped them change the trajectory and help them break out of some of this.
I share the sense that people are less expert than they once were, but I think that's true of lots of things. I think it's just me getting older. So I think the data is really important to make sure it's not just me getting older. And it seems like, and I should take this up with Frances instead of you, since it's her data, but in both those pictures are consistent with really large growth in congressional staffs, more growth in communications and local, but the non-communications, non-local is also growing in these graphs. So I'm not quite sure these graphs are slam dunk evidence for for substitution away from.
Right, and I'm not trying to make a causal claim at all.
It's not a causal claim. It's actually a measurement claim, because it's more telling in the second picture, because the total growth is tremendous. And so the proportion, and then the bottom one is the proportions of the total. And so the total non-communication staff, both of those pictures.
Sure. So to be clear, in both of these graphs that I take from Francis, this is growth in leadership staff as opposed to all staff. If I were to put up the data from Vital Statistics on all staff across the institutions, they would show declines, not as dramatic as this growth in leadership staff, but the number of congressional staff in both chambers has fallen over time.
So what we want to know is what we want to know for your purposes is what has happened to the trends in leadership and members in the non-communications, non-local staff, and so that So you should be able to do it from these pictures, but that would be the kind of clearer task for the client of expertise.
Right. I mean, so one of the things I'm taking away from these, particularly this substitution of staff towards state and district functions and away from DC-based functions.
These are casework. It's casework.
Yeah. And so my assumption, and perhaps this is incorrect, but I think it's a fair assumption, that if you are a district-based House aide, why would you have procedural expertise? And given that this is the share, it means that as the share in the district grows, you're having a low.
But it's going to depend on the total numbers. I mean, you've got it going from 38 to 48.
Right.
Over 30 years would be nice. What you really want to see is the change in the people who will be directly involved in these things. And I agree there's going to be a substitution out of member staff into leadership staff, because we know that a lot of stuff gets centralized. If you're going to make an assessment about the overall expertise of the entire chamber, it seems like you've got to take some of these things and kind of move them around and get at trends in kind of non-communication, non-local staff for leaders and for members, and see what's going on there.
That's fair.
Alan.
I want to follow up on this. I think you already answered this. I just want to make sure I understand. So if we look at this figure, then am I correct in understanding, take from say 1993 to 2015, this is personal staff or this is member staff. Yep. The actual raw numbers of member staff, or the average raw numbers of member staff, has been declining over time?
Yes.
Okay.
They seem to be substituting into leadership.
You're right. Yeah, I understand. I still just want to even know, at the granular level of the members' offices.
You actually see a market for the expert staff that remains in Washington. Is there a bidding war? I mean, do you actually see members looking around for, if this is a scarce good, a good that is becoming increasingly scarce, are they commanding more? Are they having more?
Yeah, it's a good question that I don't have the answer to, and would be, I think, an interesting thing to look at in this context. Yes and no. It depends on kind of what time frame that you want to look at. In more recent years, and we have more granular data on who the individuals are, the data is very messy, but you could start to get at some of these questions. What is interesting, and sort of just an anecdotal level, is to watch what has happened to some of the most, and the budget process, where I follow this most closely, what has happened to some of the most prominent budget experts, staff level in Congress. So, for example, on the Republican side, one of the Senate Budget Committee's top procedural experts has decided that he would accept a mid-level political appointment at the State Department, and decided to do that just before things were ramping up on the reconciliation front this year, which I thought was unusual choice and would sort of run counter to what you were suggesting. But I think that is it's an interesting question. Yeah.
So just following up on, I guess, all the last sequence. If you were going to, I think, take what I take to be Nolan's suggestion and just look sort of directly at the subset of staff that would have the most procedural involvement, and then look at turnover actually within those positions. So we think about sort of procedural expertise. It's not just how many staffers and how long they've been in the position, or sort of the breadth of experience they have. It would just be interesting to see if we actually see variation across policy areas, if we kind of get that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have data on changing committee staff over time, and so that would be one place where you get at some of this. Although, again, I think the most interesting thing to do is to start to look at actual individual turnover, which we're getting better at doing. But the data leaves much to be desired.
A lot of things confuse me about Washington these days.
Me too.
But the one that's closest to what you're doing is why the committee chairs put up with the way things are being done these days. Because they have that legitimate claim to expertise because they have relatively high experience of a jurisdiction-specific form. And I mean, it's clearly not working well.
Yeah.
So why aren't they revolting?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I often think about in that context is what has been the effect of post-1994 imposition of term limits for Republican committee chairmen in the House. And so when someone becomes a committee chair in the House, how much expertise in that policy area do they have relative to what a committee chairman had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? And as this is not data that I have here, but as we also think that congressional careers for members might be getting shorter, I'm sure Alan has looked at this, that also I think affects the ability to actually develop substantive policy expertise. So one question would be, how much expertise do committee chairs really have in their policy areas? And do they still see being a committee chairman as a place where that's what they're doing with the role versus something else? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, directly related to that, just in Craig and my work, we demonstrate post-1994, there's a huge drop-off in terms of the average, quote-unquote effectiveness of committee chairs. I mean, committee chairs are always more effective than the average rank-and-file member on our scores, but the slope is a lot less steep, or it's a lot more moderate post-1994. And then if you compare it to prior times when the Democrats ran the House before term limits were imposed, some of these committee chairs that were holding on to it for 5, 6, 7, 8 terms, they were really successful getting things moved through their committees, whereas a lot of these Republicans, right when they're kind of ramping up, all of a sudden they lose their committees.
Good answers.
Yeah.
Can you measure drafting errors? I was just thinking, so it'd be interesting. When they go back and actually try and fix some of these things.
Yeah. So the only thing that I've seen that's looked to do this in any systematic way is not even terribly contemporary, which is that John Llewellyn has this paper where he looks at star prints, which are times when they've issued corrected bill text. But I would love to be able to do that. I'd love to be able to think about that in a more systematic way, because I think there's something there, or at least even if there's not actually something there, the conditions are ripe for there to be something there. And I think we've talked about it a lot in the context of the ACA, because we had a couple very high-profile cases of things that the drafters of the bill said, oh, this is a drafting error. This is not what we meant to do. But unless you find beautiful examples, like when Tom Graves wants to fund the rest of the government at $967 million.
I've seen some like individual provisions hidden in bills that are technical amendments, which are really interesting, and I haven't figured out how to measure that consistently over time very well, or easily maybe.
What will an example be?
Gosh, right off the top of my head. Let's see
Put you
here.
on the spot.
So, put me on the spot, that's okay.
So you should spotlight would be okay.
So, let's see. Of course, I keep thinking about the Affordable Care Act because Molly's been pulling that up, and I can't think of a really good one in there. But generally, what it would say is that you would have a healthcare bill, for instance, and they're writing about Medicaid or Medicare, and then all of a sudden, a provision will say, Section 28E, a technical amendment to provision such and such of bill passed, and it will say either the name of the act or it will have public law XYZ. And it will list it. And then for me, because it's not something I needed to code for any of my data, I'd be like, oh, that's interesting, and on I would go. But at the back of my mind, I was like, I wonder how often these technical amendments occur, and are they ever contentious? Are they really easy to slip through the process? And I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, and I don't, for example, when I gave that example about when Congress in December of 2013 made a veterans provision that they weren't intending to, and then they came back and they fixed it in an omnibus bill in January 2014. I don't know what language that provision carried in the broader omnibus, but it's also interesting that instead of just bringing a technical corrections bill, they folded it into another omnibus. Yeah.
So I just want to get your gut reaction, I mean, your personal thoughts on this. So think specifically about the veterans disability part there. Who do you think is to blame in that? Do you view that as a failure of personal staff, or do you view that as a failure of legislative counsel? And that's why I was wondering, and then related to that question, I was curious, do you have data, or does Francis or anyone have data on legislative counsel and whether or not that's actually increased or decreased over time?
So on the specific question of Office of Legislative Counsel staff, I'm trying to picture the relevant vital stats table in my head. And I can't remember if that is, because we break out some within chamber support staff. I can't remember if that is a specific category that we look at, but that would be interesting. And my hunch, like again, my personal reaction is that that error is more likely to be the failure of the staff drafting the bill than it is of the Office of Legislative Counsel. And if it was an Office of Legislative Counsel error, it's again because of the speed at which these things are happening and changing. So in that case, that was part of this budget deal negotiated by Paul Ryan and Patty Murray in December of 2013, where they were frantically trying to reach a deal that would allow them to raise the Budget Control Act caps on discretionary spending in order to then get the subsequent appropriations work done and avoid another government shutdown. And so it was a big bill that was being again negotiated behind closed doors largely and quickly. So my hunch is that that's where the error was, but I don't know. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the sort of trend away from procedural expertise and how to interpret it. So if everyone everyone knows Dingell's quote, right, about the importance of policy, rules to getting policy outcomes. And if I'm going to take sort of behavior as a reflection of goals in a kind of standard rational choice kind of way, I guess I'm having a hard time understanding the disincentive. So does it mean perhaps then that for whatever reason, members actually care in some ways less about policy? I mean, it's sort of a counterintuitive interpretation maybe, but if you understand the relationship between procedures and policies, and you're not investing enough in procedures, does that somehow is that a reflection that they don't actually care enough about policy, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my interpretation of it would be not that they don't care about policy, but that they don't think that they have the ability to affect the policies that get developed. And that as we see fewer, larger, more restrictively negotiated bills come to the floor, if you're an average rank and file member, you don't think that you have the opportunity to have input into that process. And so
the marginal benefit of one more person working on casework
is higher to you than, I think, the marginal benefit of, and part of it is also like I think that there may be kind of ideological motivations for this too, or just the idea that if you are a, I could imagine a member of Congress who is, say, anti-Washington, thinking, if I'm going to spend my money, I want my office budget. First of all, I might purposefully not spend all of it and take pride in returning some of it to the United States Treasury. There are offices that do this, and they make a big deal out of it. But if of the money I'm going to spend, maybe it's a better reflection of what I think I should be doing as a representative to spend more of that on district-based staff, especially if I don't think that I'm going to have an influence on policy.
So it's basically, there's more of a collective action problem.
Yeah.
In some ways, it kind of flips the original party's collective action problems like upside down, right? Like parties solve collective action problems, but really there's a collective action problem among members to actually get policies done.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Yeah.
Actually, I don't think that the staffing expertise is really the kind of important part of the story. I think, the story about procedures and affecting legislative quality, you have procedures affect the need for speed, secrecy, all these other things. Those in and of themselves, even if expertise and staffing were the same, would lead to less quality, because if closed doors, fewer experts are involved, you got less expertise being involved, speed is just going to rush things. And so it seems like those are the key drivers, the impact that procedures have, procedures plus partisanship or polarization, whatever, on centralization, secrecy, and speed. And then there's probably a second order effect, which is on the staffing expertise for all the reasons we just talked about in response to John's question is, once you've centralized everything, you're doing everything in the back room, then it doesn't make a lot of sense for members to spend a lot of time having their own experts because they're not participating.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily want to suggest that kind of all of these things that I am discussing are of equal blame or importance in driving what we've seen. What I do think is important to think about in the staff context is that when you get to a point where you don't have staff expertise outside of a handful of staff, if you are a rank and file member who is at all interested in trying to change the course of these broader trends, you're not well equipped to do so, in part because you don't have the expertise, and you don't have access to staff who has the expertise. And I would return to the example of the Freedom Caucus, where part of where we saw them potentially make an important change in the trajectory of the institution is because they just they acquired some relevant procedural expertise. Yeah.
Just in taking all of these challenges and pressures into account, out of curiosity, do we have any data on how much, the NCR, for example, may or may not appropriate for the sake of providing that kind of expertise, especially for newer candidates who may be coming in with a bit more of a deficit of that knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, my hunch is that it is not terribly important to party organizations to equip their new members with procedural expertise. Alan can correct me if I'm wrong, but one thing that I believe his data shows is that people under certain conditions, people who come from state legislatures to Congress are somewhat more effective. Am I right about this?
People that came from professionalized state legislatures tend to be more effective than rank and file members, but people that came from less professionalized legislatures are actually worse than rank and file members.
And that would be broadly consistent.
They vote against the Deep South, right?
That would be broadly consistent with this idea that, like, if you come to Washington with a set of skills that you, even though the procedural environment in state legislatures, which is not something I know a whole lot about, but I believe varies significantly across states and is not necessarily related to what happens in Congress. There's probably something there. But yeah, I would say that it is not my sense that that the parties perceive it in their political interest to have this be a place where they invest resources.